Thank you very much, Michael. Good evening, everyone. It's fantastic to be back. I think I was last in this chamber sometime around 2000 or 2001. I have no idea what the debate is that I was part of, but I do remember that Boy George was either on my team or in the opposition team. So I don't know whether that's good or bad in terms of how my memory's stuck. But this is a fabulous place, and it's great to be back. It's particularly good to be back because I now have the honor and privilege of working for one of the most special civil society organizations in the world, Oxfam, a global network that includes some 10,000 colleagues working in almost 90 countries around the world, pushing forward an incredibly important agenda on sustainable development. But it's great to be here because it all started about 200 meters that way in the basement of the university church. It was October 1942, it was the height of the Second World War, and some Oxford students, academics, and townsfolk came together in the basement of that church that evening, on the 5th of October 1942, and wanted to do something about an awful situation that was emerging. In Greece, which was held by the Nazi forces, a famine was breaking out. And these concerned citizens who formed the Oxford Committee for Famine Relief set about doing two things. The first was to raise money to provide resources to the Greek Red Cross to provide food to prevent famine. And the second thing they did was to begin campaigning against the British government, the Churchill government position of so-called total war, this idea, this doctrine that no food relief, no relief should be provided behind Nazi-held lines, which the founders of Oxfam thought was morally repugnant, that we as a civilized humanity could not afford to watch people die when their deaths were preventable. And so they raised resources to prevent famine, but they also challenged government policy to change policy, which they successfully did. And it's been that dual philosophy that's been at the heart of Oxfam for 79 odd years. And I'm delighted to be here today because I think it's another moment in British history, another moment in world history where we need another set of actions of brave civic leadership to forge what might best be called a new internationalism. I've just come back from the climate talks in Glasgow, COP26, where the future of our planet, the future of our species is being discussed, where there was some important progress, but still a tangible lack of the international solidarity that's so desperately needed, so urgently needed if we are to prevent climate catastrophe, not just for our species, but for all life on Earth. And here is a moment when humanity needs to come together for quick, urgent, dramatic, decisive action to reduce climate emissions, to provide climate finance so that other countries that have had almost nothing to do with causing climate change, can mitigate and adapt their way out of this climate crisis. And yet, there was a lack of that international solidarity. And so I think when you look at the climate agenda, this is a moment where we need another reset, where citizens need to come together to lead the way in providing that international solidarity. But the same applies for our global response to the COVID pandemic. It is a tragedy that only 3% of people in the poorest parts of the world have been able to access a COVID vaccine, whereas those of us who are fortunate to live in the West, in the global North, some 70-odd% of us have been able to access a vaccine, and many have chosen not to access it. That discrepancy, which many are calling a vaccine apartheid, is morally repugnant, but it's also incredibly inefficient when it comes to a global response to a pandemic. We have the technology, we have the means, we have the recipe, we have the intellectual property to be able to roll out vaccines at a far greater rate than we currently are, to provide for anyone in the world, everyone in the world, to be able to access a vaccine cheaply, and yet we haven't. Developed countries, big pharmaceutical companies have put blocks in the way of genuine access to what we call a people's vaccine. So there too, I think there's a moment where citizens need to come together to organize, to mobilize, to push for a fairer response, a fairer, just recovery from the COVID pandemic. I could go on, but I think this is the moment where citizens of the world need to come together, bound by a sense of solidarity, of a new internationalism, to be able to respond to these global challenges, whether that's climate change or the COVID pandemic. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation about how we might best do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danny, for that opening remark. I think there's a lot you said that I would like to get into. But so our members and our viewers to sort of like get to know you a bit more and understand who you are, could you tell us a bit about your growing up, your upbringing in Sri Lanka, and how that has shaped your values into who you are today?
Right. No, thank you. I've actually been thinking a lot about where I grew up. I spent the first 6 years of my life on a little island off the coast of Sri Lanka. It's a little island called Karnagar. And I've been thinking about it a lot this week because it's an island whose maximum elevation is 8 meters above sea level. And I spent 6 amazing years in the late 1970s there with my grandparents while my parents were overseas studying in Australia and New Zealand respectively for their doctorates. And for me, that was a period of incredible bliss. But if I think about what's happened over the last 40 years, there's been a brutal civil war in Sri Lanka, dismantling of democracy and human rights in that country, and now a climate emergency that's affecting the people of that not just that island, but across the world. My own journey, I feel incredibly fortunate. My parents, having finished their PhDs, took me out of Sri Lanka and to Papua New Guinea first, then to Australia, and then to this place where I came on a Rhodes Scholarship, as you said, Michael, to do my MPhil and then DPhil. And since then, I've been here and in South Africa. But to me, it's that sense of luck, of gratitude, that I was fortunate enough to have lived in relatively prosperous, stable, and happy places, whereas almost everyone born in that era, in a place like Sri Lanka, will have lived a much more difficult life. And I think that sense of guilt, if you will, has stayed with me and influenced the things I've done and the worldview I have.
Amazing. In addition to that sense of, I guess you said guilt, maybe wanting to give back for having so much in your upbringing in different societies. I'm sure you've been exposed to different cultures and different ways of living, and perhaps has exposed you to appreciate things much more nuanced than other people. Would you say that these experiences drove you towards a direction whereby you wanted a career in public life that was serving others, or was it something that you think is intrinsically part of you?
That's a very good question. I don't know if I've got an answer. I suppose my that move from Sri Lanka to Papua New Guinea and then Australia at a time when Sri Lanka descended into civil war, and I saw my own family members being killed in some cases, or in other cases having to flee and seek asylum all over the world, really, I suppose, opened my eyes to injustice in the world, and through that, a sense of responsibility that I had to do my bit to address those injustices. So, and I think through that, a sense, I hope, of public service or leadership for the public good. And it started early. I remember I moved to Australia when I was 10 years old, and an organisation that was called Community Aid Abroad, is now called Oxfam Australia, as it happens, used to do a fundraising event called Walk Against Want. And I moved when I was 10, but by 11, I'd started fundraising and took part in my first Walk Against Want, because for me, it just felt really important that I raised awareness, but also raised funds to support, in this case, international development and causes and people around the world. And yeah, that's been part of my worldview since.
Thank you. I think there's quite a connection in your experiences where you just said about how you saw family being obviously killed in the war, and how that connects with the inception of the atmosphere when Oxfam was founded, as you mentioned, in World War II. In your view, given that you have that connection to some degree, how do you think Oxfam, the way it operates now, has changed over the years, if there's anything significant, given the fact that right now perhaps, there are not exactly the same issues that was in 1942?
So I think the first observation is some things haven't changed. The sorts of issues I've already described, climate change, the COVID response, or the fact that we have more people in need of humanitarian assistance today than at any time since the Second World War is a tragedy. Here we are in the 80th year of Oxfam's existence and dealing with, in some ways, exactly the same issue, levels of famine and hunger that the world hasn't seen in those 80 years. And so I think for Oxfam, we've been doing a sort of deep strategic review and come back in some ways to the future and to say that our role is to take action, especially in the most fragile and vulnerable places around the world. So a core part of Oxfam's strategy is to be in places like Syria, Yemen, the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, where we are seeing, unfortunately, rising levels of food insecurity and hunger. And in those places where they're in refugee camps, building toilets, piping clean water, providing cash for people who've been displaced, providing food for people who don't have access to enough food. And so a critical part, I think, of Oxfam agenda all through our 80 years has been this idea that we are here to take action. But on the other hand, doing just that isn't enough, because unless we address the drivers of oppression, the drivers of injustice, then I don't think we're living up to our responsibility. And that's where this notion of challenging power, of speaking truth to power, is really important and an integral part of Oxfam's agenda. So in some ways, I think, sadly, there is continuity in terms of what we've been doing over all of these years. But that said, there are at least one important point of difference, and I think that it's to do with how the world is changing around us. If you look at the way the global economy works, or the way that geopolitical balance works, I saw it last week in Glasgow. The world is a very different place and is becoming a very different place than it was even just a few years ago. And I think there's an opportunity for organizations like ours, or maybe I should put it as networks like ours, to build a sort of people's response to some of what we're seeing around us. And some people think of Oxfam as an international NGO, an international non-governmental organization with 10,000 staff and a sort of delivery mechanism that gets the job done in different places. You could also describe us as the prototype of a global network for social justice. That even in this country, we have tens of thousands of people who volunteer with us, hundreds of thousands of people who donate to us, millions of people who shop in our network of shops around the country. And they are part of a global network of people who are concerned about poverty, about discrimination, about injustice, about climate change. And part of our role is to connect our supporters, our volunteers, into a people's movement that stands up for the poorest and most marginalized people on the planet, that stands up for the most vulnerable countries when it comes to climate change, stands up for the fact that if we know how to produce vaccines, some of which were devised in this very city, we owe a debt of obligation to provide those at cost to everyone on the planet. And so I think there is the beginning, if you will, or the re-emergence or a reset of a new type of network that connects people, that builds on people's power to respond to some of the injustice we see in the world.
Brilliant. In speaking truth to power, sometimes the response has been sort of power also challenging you. In Oxfam's perspective, how do you respond to how people perceive the controversies that Oxfam has faced over the years, and perhaps how you've gone about resolving them?
Yeah, I mean, I started at Oxfam in January of 2019, and some of you will recall that in 2018, there were revelations about misconduct, sexual misconduct by Oxfam staff in Haiti in 2011, and that they were shameful mistakes by Oxfam and some of our peers in the international development sector. I think what had happened is we had let the abuse of power take place. We had almost assumed that we could ignore harm in the name of doing good. And that's just not acceptable. I think that's been a lesson throughout many institutions in society that it's not right to cause harm in the pursuit of doing good. And, getting the how right is as important as getting the what right. It's really important that organizations like ours are there to respond when humanitarian disaster strikes. But it's equally important that we do that in a way that doesn't involve the abuse of power, and particularly the abuse of power between those who are claiming to do good and those people they're claiming to serve. And so for me, the journey of the last 3 years has really been about investing in what we call safeguarding in this country, or integrity as they call it in many other parts of the world, and getting our systems right, our processes right. And at Oxfam, we've doubled our human resources devoted to safeguarding, tripled the sort of financial investment, changed our process, redesigned a compulsory code of conduct for all staff and volunteers who work with Oxfam. But it's part of a broader cultural change that I hope puts the how on par with the what in terms of Oxfam's life. I think it's been a collective wake-up call for those of us in international development that this is really important. And in some ways, it's a glimpse of the future, because I think many, many institutions around the world are starting to realize that to thrive in the rest of the 21st century, you have to look and act and be different from the sorts of institutions that held power in the 20th century. We have to be much more open. We have to be much more transparent. We have to be much more accountable to the people we claim to be serving. We have to be much more accountable to each other. And that's not easy. And there are still challenges on our journey. But my hope is that Oxfam can lead by example in building a more transparent, more accountable, more democratic network that puts the people we work with at the heart of what we're doing, rather than on the periphery of what we're trying to do.
Yes, thank you. Whilst we were waiting outside, I sort of mentioned I had a little treat in terms of discovering or getting access to, via help from our librarian, some of the minutes from the first meeting that Oxfam had on the 5th of October. And for those minutes included, given the context of the fact that Oxfam was responding to the starvation caused behind the Allied blockade that occupied a nation in World War II. And the minutes obviously included advice on proceeding with caution, reflecting on the fears that food falling into the enemy's hands could prolong the war, and how to solve that. Oxfam since then has been campaigning against food poverty worldwide for 70 years. And I wanted to get your view on whether you feel that this mission is being encumbered by, I guess more directly, corporations that are not recognizing their impact in the system.
So I think we've had I saw it last week in Glasgow, that probably for the first time in my professional life, there is a realization that we're in the mess we're in a large part because we've let sort of short-term shareholder capitalism rip on the world. But that part of the solution has to be to devise sort of a new economy based on new principles. And what was fascinating about this COP was that there were more business leaders there than I had seen, or that colleagues who've been to many COPs have seen in the past. And that's, I think, a growing responsibility by businesses, that they have to devise the solutions to the mess that we're in. But I do, this is one of the structural issues that we have to confront. Some of you may be familiar with research that Oxfam's been publishing in recent years around the sort of vulgar levels of economic inequality that we're seeing around the world. If you look at wealth, for example, today, and you look at how wealth is distributed around the world, a tiny handful of men, and they are men, own more wealth than the poorest half of the world's population put together. At last count, it was 8 men. Now, how have we created a global economy where wealth has accumulated in those levels? Or put another way, if the world was a country, it'll be the most unequal country in the world. So we would have levels of inequality, inequity in our global system that would be intolerable, I suspect, in any sort of democracy if it were considered a country. And yet we've allowed this to happen. And so we've built a sort of increasingly unequal economic system. We've also built a system where the sort of externalities, particularly the environmental externalities of economic activity, have been underpriced chronically. And no wonder then we're facing sort of humanitarian and climate crisis that we are. And so, part of what I like about working for an organization like Oxfam is that we are working with some of the most progressive corporates in the world. We have a long-standing partnership with Unilever, one of the biggest brands in the world. And again, some of you might have seen that Unilever announced earlier this year a commitment that every worker, in not just who works for Unilever, but in their entire supply chain, will be paid a living wage. That might not sound like it's huge, but it is huge, because it's a global multinational company recognizing that its supply chain, the millions of workers who are producing the goods that we all consume on a regular basis, are an integral part of their value creation. And the idea that a corporate multinational registered here or in Amsterdam can somehow see those people in the value chain as somewhat distant and removed and don't have a moral responsibility is wrong. And we're starting to see progressive businesses starting to make that sort of connection. And I think we need to see a lot more of that much more quickly, obviously, if we are to achieve a just or sustainable world.
Thank you very much. Talking about COP26 and the impact of sort of like global world or collaboration to solve issues, Oxfam recently organized for activists in firefighter uniform to stand outside COP26, asking politicians to choose whether to use fossil fuels or live in a world where, live in a world that's livable. I was wanting to ask what work you were doing, particularly to advance sustainability, and do you think that COP26 has been a success?
No. That's the short answer. I left deeply disappointed. I recognized there was progress and there were some important announcements on deforestation, for example, on electric cars and vehicles. That's all important, but the issues that we care about at Oxfam, for example, were not addressed. We didn't see the sort of political leadership that we needed to see. Let me give you a clear example. 92% of the excess carbon emissions caused in the last 25 years were generated in rich countries. And yet, the dramatic, real, urgent impacts of climate breakdown are being felt by people who had almost nothing to do with climate breakdown. I had a colleague of mine who works in Malawi who came as part of the Oxfam delegation to COP. And Juliet was telling me that as a child, she's in her 30s, as a child, summer temperatures in the region of Malawi that she grew up in were in their low 30s. Manageable in terms of agricultural productivity, manageable in terms of lifestyle. Today, they're running in the high 30s and early 40s degrees centigrade, making a very difficult livelihood that farmers in that part of Malawi were already making out even more difficult. She said her nieces and nephews can't even go out to play in the summer because it's just too hot. And so the impact of climate change is being felt in Malawi. I met someone called Mohammed Nasheed, who many of you will recall, was the president of the Maldives, who famously did his underwater cabinet meeting to remind the world that the Maldives is so low-lying that it will go underwater. I saw him again last at COP, and I hadn't seen him for about 10 years. And he and a friend of mine who lives in the Maldives were describing how already it's not just rising sea levels, it's the fact that sea temperatures are warming that is killing off coral, which makes the fisheries, one of the most important industries in an island nation like that, less sustainable, more difficult to work. It means that the sea walls that are being built have to be higher and stronger. It means that the beach resorts that are a primary source of tourism income are already being worn away or eroded. So the impacts of climate change are here and now in places like the Maldives or Malawi, where they've had almost nothing to do with climate breakdown. And for me, the fact that rich countries promised 12 years ago that they would provide $100 billion a year of finance to help poorer countries adapt to climate change and to mitigate from climate change. That pledge has not been met yet, and by the latest analysis won't even be met for another 3 years. And we were hoping that this COP, which remember is about fulfilling the declaration made in Paris 5 years ago, including this 100 billion, would be the COP where we saw that money, and we left without having seen that money. This is the COP where we were hoping that this notion of loss and damage, this idea that countries that are already being affected by extreme climate events are being paid something. I mean, if we weren't in climate negotiations, you'd call it compensation, some form of finance to be able to help them foot the bill for the extreme weather events. We thought loss and damage would be on the table, and that we'd come out of this COP with some meaningful progress on that. But we saw nothing. And so we have, out of this COP, some really worrying watering down of language, for example, on fossil fuels, particularly coal. But we haven't also seen the action we needed to see on climate finance, on loss and damage. And so I am worried. The good news, of course, is governments have agreed to come back more regularly, to look at each country's own contributions or actions. And so all hope is not lost, where some people have said, 1.5 is alive, but on life support. And it really felt, leaving Glasgow, that that's where we are. But again, comes back to, I think, the idea that if our leaders won't show that leadership that we need, that we so desperately need, then it's up to us as citizens, as voters, as consumers, to drive that ambition, to drive that change, to hold our leaders to account. And that's why it's so important that we, each of us, not just change our behaviors when it comes to what we consume, but also change our behaviors in terms of pushing governments and companies to behave much, much better than they are currently.
Definitely. On that note, I wanted to go back a bit more onto the contribution to carbon emissions by rich nations and perhaps developing and emerging nations. Do you agree with the view that, or what's your view, what do you think of the view that argues that poorer nations shouldn't be mandated or encouraged to meet certain emission targets when richer nations are not doing so, insofar as they need economic development and they're rapidly sort of affected by the issues of climate change, but also they've got to meet standards in their own sustenance and living?
So I think a really important part of climate justice is that we don't deny poorer countries the right to development, if you will. It would be wrong if, in the rush to reduce our emissions, we also deny people in poverty the opportunity to get out of poverty. But I think what we're seeing here is we're missing the opportunity to do both, to have climate action and the reduction in poverty, or the opportunity to develop, if you will. And this is where I was a little bit disappointed by the stance of some of the major developing countries, who are making a really important political argument, which is, we need the right to develop. But I was hoping that they would also say, but we're going to lead by example in the green transition, in a just transition. We are going to develop, if you will, but in a much cleaner, greener way than the West has done over the last 150, 200 years. But also, this is where climate finance is really important. But we need your help. We need your help in being able to finance that innovation, finance that mitigation, finance that adaptation. And so, in some ways, you have the best of both worlds. You have a much quicker, more dramatic green transition, but you also have a better chance of leveling the sort of global economic playing field. So I think that is really important. And for me, that's what climate justice is about. It's about making sure that we aren't just sort of taking the necessary actions now in terms of reducing our own carbon footprints, but making sure that we aren't having these unintended consequences around poverty or inequality. And if I may, a really clear example of that is on net zero. So this is a phrase that many of us are now very familiar with. At Oxfam, we looked at the net zero pledges of many major governments and major companies, about 200 or so pledges that have been published. Most of them are very vague about how governments or these major corporates are going to achieve net zero. But if you tally up the offsetting requirements that they're in these plans and discount the unproven technologies, and you end up relying on afforestation, the planting of new trees and forests to become carbon sinks to suck up the emissions that we're going to be pumping out. Now, when you do this aggregation, and it's a very simple aggregation of just what's published by these companies and these corporates and governments, you end up with 1.6 billion hectares of land needed over the coming decades to plant the new forests, 5 times the size of India, equivalent to all arable land in use today. And what dawns on you is that we've got ludicrous amounts, these promises, when you aggregate them, are ludicrous and unachievable, but even if we came close to it, you would have disastrous impacts on food security. We're already seeing in the world rising food prices, as I said, rising levels of hunger. And if in the course of climate action, rich countries and big companies say, well, we're not going to reduce our carbon emissions, instead we're going to offset them, but in the process of doing that, we need to buy up more land, drive food prices up. You have the worst of all worlds. We're not taking the action we need now to reduce carbon emissions, and we're having these unintended consequences on people in poverty. And I think that's where these equity concerns are so important, and why I left Glasgow frustrated, because I don't think leaders have grasped that deep interconnectedness between a just and sustainable world that we have to achieve.
Thank you. Going back into what shaped you, you mentioned about how you studied both the MPhil and DPhil here at Oxford, and obviously you're a proponent of the power of education. Right now, we're just speaking about how we can improve society, and this one method is looking into climate justice. But another tool, of course, is education. And I thought to ask what role you think education can play going forward to improve modern society, especially from your perspective.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, one of the reasons why I feel incredibly grateful or guilty, depending on the day, is because I've had access to the world's best educational institutions, largely for free. I was lucky enough to do my state education in Australia, a degree at the University of Sydney, and then came here on a Rhodes Scholarship to do my MPhil and DPhil. And in terms of, if you compare the life chances of someone born in 1975 in Jaffna in Sri Lanka, and you plot the sort of cohort of boys that would have been born in that hospital around that time, I have been incredibly fortunate, in a large part because I've had access to these educational opportunities. And so one of the drivers, I suppose, is, for me, and one of my sort of motivations is, how can we create more opportunities for more people to be able to, to fulfill their potential. And education is key. It's also, it seems, where there's a sort of a quiet revolution that's waiting to happen, and that's around sort of access to education. We now have the tools, the platforms, the technology to be able to deliver education, high quality educational interventions at very low cost. One of the most exciting things that's happening in many parts of the global south, of what I call the developing world, is that, powered by mobile technologies or the internet, we're seeing the delivery of education. Now, we need greater public investment. It was very disappointing here in the UK. You might remember just a few months ago, there was a big international summit, a global partnership on education, where rich countries, again, were asked to provide finance for investment in public education. They failed to meet the pledges that were expected. And unless we have that sort of urgent investment, we won't fulfill those opportunities. But I do think that's a really important ingredient, if you will, of a fairer, more equitable world.
Thank you. In being the first Asian Australian Rhodes Scholar, you clearly brought barriers, and to win the scholarship here and be the youngest ever person to be the director of the Royal Commonwealth Society. And right now we're just talking about how we can use education how different people can use education to sort of like break barriers. I wonder what your message will be to others who might be facing different barriers and challenges in their life, and what advice you would give to them from the perspective of how you got to where you are today in face of obvious challenges and breaking glass ceilings.
I suppose it's, for me, it's always helped to have a higher purpose, if you will, which has been around notions of service, of public leadership, and that's helped me because that's what gave me the drive to say, look, I, despite facing discrimination or racism or barriers, that I'm here to do a job and to make the world a better place, or to make it more just, more fair. And that's helped me, I think. And I know when I speak to other leaders, it's been that drive, that zeal that is so important. And so I think channeling on that is going to be really important. And I do feel that we're on the cusp of, particularly in this country, reimagining our institutions to be much more diverse and inclusive. There was the point I was making earlier, that the traditional 20th century institution, I suppose this one predates even that, need to reimagine how they work in the rest of the 21st century. How do we make ourselves more equitable, accountable, transparent, open, participatory, democratic? And again, there are no shortages of ways of doing that. And that also includes making ourselves more representative of the societies we draw from or claim to serve. And I think that's starting to happen, not quickly enough. But I think there is a moment where we're seeing a sort of transformation. And I hope that's happening in Oxfam. When I started at Oxfam, we made a promise that our senior leadership would be representative of the rest of the organization when it came to gender and ethnicity. And we now have, I think the majority of our senior leaders are women, and the leaders of color in our organization now match the rest of the organization and the rest of British society. And that wasn't the case a few years ago. But we've consciously said, in order to be a more credible organization in our field, we've got to represent or reflect the communities we work in and the communities we serve. And I hope that's actually made us a far more effective organization, because now in our meetings, we can talk about lived experience when it comes to gender inequality or racial discrimination. And I think that's ultimately where we want to go, where we think that each organization, each institution in society is enhanced, is richer, is more effective, because it's leaned into this questions of equality, diversity, and inclusion. This isn't just about checklists and quotas. It's about fundamentally rethinking how organizations work and what value they add to society.
Thank you. Like, you're working a lot on almost trying to make older, perhaps, institutions adapt to society today, reimagine themselves in the modern age that we are today. And you're a member of the UN Secretary General's High Panel on Digital Cooperation. And your work, obviously, in a different way, kind of leads on to this. I want to ask what you think of the role you play there, how the digital infrastructure could be used to foster collaboration, especially in the modern age.
Well, on the first part of your question, I'm fascinated by institutions, and so I don't know why, but I've gravitated towards older institutions. The Royal Commonwealth Society was 140 years old when I started working there. Oxfam was 70 odd years old, and what they have in common is that these were, they're called civil society organizations, or sometimes we call them voluntary organizations, because they've come about because people coming together. It's the 8 people in the basement of the university church up the road that created this notion of this civic formation. And I think there's incredible power in modernizing, reimagining, evolving these civic institutions. We also need new things, but I think there is value in trying to reform and modernize and update existing institutions. And society and the world will be a richer place with more effective older institutions. And so in some ways I've gravitated towards those. But you're right, I had a privilege of serving the UN Secretary General as a member of his high-level panel on digital cooperation. It was in Guterres very soon after he started. In fact, I think it's the only high-level panel he's set up in his term. And he wanted to look at this notion of digital cooperation, and he asked Melinda Gates and Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, to co-chair a group of us, 22 of us from around the world, to look at this question of what does digital cooperation look like in the rest of the 21st century. And we worked over 18 months or so, and we have a report, it's called The Age of Interdependence, which is online if you want to look at it. And I think there is something fascinating, potentially troubling, but also potentially fantastic going on around how the digital transformation is, changing almost everything in society. It's deeply worrying because we're seeing the sort of real world inequities and inequalities sometimes being amplified in the digital world. A significant proportion of the world still doesn't have access to a mobile telephone, let alone fast internet. And so if we're going to harness the potential of the digital transformation, we need much better cooperation to level the playing field on digital access. But on the other hand, we know if you take the opportunities for democracy, for participation, where I think we're at the foothills of a very exciting era for rethinking what democracy is like. This is a country, for example, where we've assumed that a healthy democracy just needs a regular election. Once every few years, we go and cast a ballot. It's first past the post in a single member constituency. Job done. Turns out, I don't think that, you have more regular elections at the Oxford Union, I know, but even, we could do better than that. We can have much more participatory mechanisms, more liquid democracy, more everyday democracy. And I think there are some interesting opportunities, I think, for us to create, harnessing these digital tools, much more creative ways in which people can come together, can organize, can mobilize, can govern, can co-create. And I think there's some exciting opportunities there. And we call the report The Age of Interdependence because some of you, I suspect most of you are too young to remember, but in the late 1990s, there was a manifesto written by the pioneers of the digital world. And it was called the Declaration of Cyber Independence. Look it up, it's a fascinating document, and it was early days of the internet and digital transformation. And basically a bunch of people, mostly from Silicon Valley, said the digital era is independent from the real world. It was a sort of manifesto, a rant against old world structures, of industrial structures, of old governance structures. And they said, we're going to create a new world that's different. But what's happened over the last quarter of the century is as more and more aspects of our lives have become touched by digital transformation, I think it's become clearer we're ever more interdependent. We're more interdependent about, the way that our data flows between each of us and the corporates and governments that we transact with. We're more interdependent because if you look at global challenges, whether they're migration, climate change, poverty, vaccine access, we're far more interconnected as a society than we were, and probably many people even imagined 25 years ago. And so the question in some ways that our panel tried to answer or address was, how do we lean into that interconnectedness? How do we make sure that the digital era is one that's more inclusive, that drives towards equality or more equal outcomes? And there's a lot to play for, a huge amount to play for, because I think the shape of the world over the next few decades is going to be decided in large part about how we settle questions of, for example, privacy, data rights, digital equality, how, for example, we invest in digital inclusion. And there's a lot happening, and I don't know enough about it because this is not my area of expertise, but it's really important that we have good minds and good people working on some of these issues, because if not, we risk doing a lot of damage to the sort of global social fabric. And we're starting to see some of the dangers of what can happen when, for example, the power of digital corporations is unleashed without checks and balances on society.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was enjoying that interview so much that I sort of might have run over for audience questions. So we might have just one time for just one person to speak. Does anyone want to ask a question? I recognize that member with the red jacket.
So in terms of the climate change, so I wonder, so what do you think is the most important thing to do to address this problem?
So for me, the most urgent thing is reducing carbon emissions now. A lot of what I saw in Glasgow and in other conversations is this idea that we've got enough time to sort of get leisurely to net zero. And if you look at, the sort of, we can get to net zero by acting now, sort of dramatically decreasing carbon or leisurely getting to carbon. And the impacts, as the science is clear, every fraction of a degree Celsius of global temperature warming is going to have disastrous impacts. And so I think the most urgent thing to do is to say, what can each of us do? Every country in the world, comes back to your point about what developing countries need to do as well, is to reduce carbon now.
Sweet. One last question. I recognize the member with the blue jumper. Just wait for the mic to be given to you before you start speaking, please.
Fascinating already, and thank you so much for coming here. Lots of topics and lots of questions for sure buzzing around my head, but one was the restructuring of traditional companies and approaching traditional industry and how they should evolve in the future. Do you believe that any historical industries or organizations can fail and should fail? And I say that in the sense of job loss and the ramifications on certain people who have been invested in industries, the transition there. How do you transition out of, let's say, traditional mining organizations or oil and gas, resource intensive, heavily impactful? But yeah, thank you.
So I think there is sometimes a false choice. I mean, I do genuinely believe that there are good green jobs out there, and that we can and will transition our societies. We have to stop our addiction to fossil fuels, and we have to stop the vulgar public subsidy of fossil fuels. I mean, the easiest way to finance some of this climate action is to stop the world's subsidizing of fossil fuels. And the best thing we can do is to keep oil and gas in the ground, to your point about what more can we do to reduce carbon. And so, there is some accountability there around sort of industries that we have allowed to survive, not just survive, but thrive, and in some ways collude with, and corrupt the way that we think about the world. So I think this is a moment where we have to look hard at some industries. But I also see an opportunity there. I've said at several points about how important it is for citizens to come together and organize. In this country, we've had about 400 years of something called registered charities. We had the first Charities Act in 1604, and since then we've had these wonderful organizations like this one. I think the Oxford Union is a registered charity, someone can get me wrong. And that's been fantastic because we've had this idea of formalizing civic action. But the corollary of that is we've had, at the other end of the spectrum, this idea that companies, private enterprise, can just go about making profit at all costs. And in some ways, the future needs to be in the middle. That this difference, this bifurcation of doing well and doing good no longer stands. And you can put it in different ways. You can call it a triple bottom line, you can call it sustainable or social enterprise. But to me, the sort of, so rather than think about what needs to fail, or where are the stranded assets and things, I think we need to crowd into this middle to say, how can we build sort of social and sustainable enterprises? And that will reshape the way the economy works, and it will reshape the sort of balance of power in our societies. And I think that's an opportunity. And I'm optimistic that, again, we're at the foothills of these sort of new formations that won't be about extractive, short-term, shareholder-led capitalism, and be much more about creating sort of sustainable and equitable value.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Danny. It's been a true pleasure.